Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week we have a Halloween special because on Thursday, as we release the podcast, is of course 31st. And what better way to celebrate Halloween than having a Halloween special? And what better topic than to talk about Dante's Inferno? And this week I'm joined by Francis Young. And tell me, as always, I try to get to know just a little bit. So, what is your interest in Dante's Inferno?
Well, I think that my interest in Dante's Inferno goes back to a TV program that I saw when I was quite young. And this was probably a long forgotten TV program now, but it was called Strange Landscape. And it was a documentary presented by Christopher Frayling. And it was about the Middle Ages. And one of the episodes was a kind of reenactment of, quite vivid reenactment of parts of Dante's Inferno. And I think that what really stayed with me about this wasn't just the kind of the gory bits and the appeal of Dante's Inferno, which to kids is something which is quite appealing, I think,
Mm.
but also the fact that Frayling was trying to explain, where does this come from? This extraordinary vision of hell. What's the point of it? Why write an entire book that's focusing on a journey into hell? And so I think that's kind of stayed with me. And then, of course, I went on to read Dante's Inferno. And I became fascinated by how it provides us a kind of window into the Middle Ages, but also what's special about the Inferno, because it's written around about the turn of the 14th century. It's in Italy, of course, it's being written, and it's in the vernacular. And so there's a sense in which it's also very much a work that is looking forward towards the Renaissance. So while we think of it as this kind of absolutely classic medieval work, almost the kind of paradigmatic medieval work, it is also looking beyond the Middle Ages.
And still, of course, it's vastly popular today. It still holds up so immensely good, and it's not like daunting to read. It's exciting to read, and it's fun to read because you meet all these classical characters, as I'm sure we will discuss later on. But it still holds up so well, even 500-600 years later, that after it was written.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that there are elements of our culture that it very much chimes with. I think that there's an element of fantasy literature in there. And I think that, things like World of Warcraft, Dungeons and Dragons, this idea
Yeah,
that you
definitely
create a
D&D.
fantasy
Yeah,
world, people it with your characters. But I think also this kind of fantasy wish fulfillment. I mean, who doesn't want to imagine their enemies being tortured forever in
yeah.
the fires of hell? There is
Oh
that
yeah.
kind of element of it that is kind of rather salacious. And so it's simultaneously a very kind of elevating and inspiring work of literature, and yet also has these rather base elements of kind of wanting to see your enemies punished.
Yeah. I mean, before we go into the Inferno, I want to give a little bit background on Dante. And you are mainly a religious historian, but I want to begin, and because I feel you need a little introduction to not the Dante in the Inferno, in the Divine Comedy, but the real Dante. And we will discuss this later as well, that in the Divine Comedy, it's not Dante, the author, necessarily, who goes into the Inferno, but it is a kind of a different version of Dante that goes into the Inferno, for lack of better words.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's very much a kind of a portrayal of Dante as he wants to be seen. And he is a scholar. He is somebody who is intimately involved in the politics of Florence, and yet he's also to some extent an outsider. And so I think you've got this perspective of someone who, has been very much involved in the convoluted and sometimes completely overwhelming and baffling history of late medieval Florence, and yet also is trying to rise above that. And so he's in middle age at the time that he's writing this. He's been exiled from Florence, and so to a large extent, this is kind of a project which he has the time and the leisure to do because he is excluded from his community. And it's kind of an intermingling of reality with imagination, but also, of course, with spirituality. And so there are these elements of history in which he is going back and commenting on recent history partly by highlighting, which people are in hell and how they're suffering, and some of them are his personal enemies. Others, however, are people who simply reflect what he considers to be bad traits in the history of the time, traits of corruption and fraud and simony and things like that he has a particular intolerance for. And also kind of it's an exercise in erudition, because he is drawing upon the classical past, he is drawing upon his own classical learning. There are there are some little things where he tries to um, counteract these calumnies that have been brought against him. So there's an aside at one point where he talks about the simoniacs who are suffering in these kind of font-shaped tubes that they've been forced into, and he uses that as an opportunity to say, I didn't do what I'm accused of. I was accused of damaging a font in a church in Florence, and I didn't do that. And so these kind of little scores that he has to settle all the time.
There is, as you mentioned, there are some of his enemies in the, as we will, I'm sure again we will talk about when we get there, but there's also a lot of Italian politics of the time that Dante writes about in the book, so you kind of have to be a little bit aware of the Italian politics as well when you read the book as well, or you can also look up that afterwards, of course, but there are some Italian politics of Dante's time that he writes about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, understanding the conflict between the white and the black Guelphs, and the relationship between those factions and the papacy and the emperor, and how Italy at that time is really just it's a paradox, because on the one hand, it's probably the most culturally advanced part of Europe, or culturally advanced part of Western Europe. And at the same time, so this great kind of cradle of art and culture and kind of burgeoning Renaissance. And yet at the same time, it's utterly disunited, utterly racked by conflict, a playground of European princes, like, the King of France, constantly leading expeditions in there. You've got the Kingdom of Naples, in the south. You've got a Spanish involvement through that. You've got the papacy and the papal states struggling, and you've got an area. Florence is kind of at the heart of this commonwealth of kind of independent Italian city-states, which essentially maintain their independence by, sort of playing these superpowers off against each other. And it's extraordinary to me, and I think rather baffling to anyone studying this period. How did they maintain such cultural vitality whilst at the same time being such kind of hotbeds of political instability?
Now, let's begin with, of course, because we had to get through the Inferno, and that's what the main topic of this episode is. But let's begin with how does Dante, the character, and again, what I expressed is not the actual Dante, how does Dante, the character, end up in hell in the first place?
Well, it's essentially a book about a midlife crisis, in that it famously begins with Dante in the middle of his life. So he's about 35 in the story. It's Good Friday 1300, and he finds himself in a dark wood. Now, of course, this dark wood is a place of metaphor. It's a symbolic wood, and he finds himself confronted by a hill that he's got to try and climb up, and there are these three beasts. There's a wolf, a lion, and a leopard that bar his way and represent the besetting sins of humanity. So you've got the sort of the carnal lusts represented by the wolf, the violence represented by the lion, and the sort of tendency to fraud and deception represented by the leopard. And these then become the dominant themes of the journey. These are the three broad categories of sin in terms of which Dante sees the world. And he is then confronted by the shade of the poet Virgil. And I think this is where it becomes clear that the Inferno is going to rise above the level of merely another kind of Christian morality tale, because Virgil is, of course, a non-Christian figure. So he is somebody from the sphere of pagan learning. And I think what is eternally fascinating about Dante is the way in which he is interested in combining the Christian and the pagan. And it's that fusion, almost seamless fusion of themes from the ancient world and from biblical biblical narrative, which he doesn't seem to have any qualms about doing this, and I think that that is something which is always striking to us as modern readers, because we tend to see these as kind of two worlds that can't really interact, as kind of an eternal conflict within the Western canon. But Dante doesn't. And so Virgil is in this kind of unusual position. He is a shade, that is to say, he belongs to the limbo of the pagans. He is somebody who lived a virtuous life and embodied all of the best human natural virtues, but because he could never know Christ, he is kind of consigned to this shadow realm, which in due course they're going to visit. But he has been tasked by God via Beatrice and via the Virgin Mary.
Beatrice was his wife, by the way. You should probably add that Beatrice or Beatrice was his wife in real life as well.
Yeah, Beatrice kind of represents purity. So she is somebody that we'll eventually meet in the Paradiso. But at this point, she is kind of an agent of the divine. And Virgil has been given this power, not only to pass beyond hell himself, so to have this kind of free passage through hell, but also to guide Dante on this journey. Now, this in itself is very much a theme of classical epic. So in the classical epics, the hero traditionally will undertake an anabasis. So an anabasis being a kind of journey to the underworld. So the descent of the hero, even though the hero is still alive. And that's a theme which in classical myth goes all the way back to Orpheus, of course. So the myth of Orpheus, where Orpheus is permitted by the gods, after, beseeching their intercession, to go down to the underworld and retrieve Eurydice. But of course, it doesn't work out like that, because the condition of this retrieval of Eurydice is that he mustn't look back on her, and eventually he does, and of course that means that she is not able to return. And so it's this kind of sense of a liminal encounter between the world of the living and the world of the dead. We find it in the Odyssey, we find it in the Aeneid, where Aeneas has to go down to the underworld as well. And so that in itself is a classical theme. But the underworld, which Dante constructs, is this extraordinary melange of both the classical and the biblical.
I may be wrong, but you mentioned that Virgil was in limbo, but isn't there kind of a different area for pagans where they kind of have their own chill out area, kind of like a lounge area, because they haven't met Christ, they're quite allowed in heaven or hell, kind of, they're their own little VIP lounge?
Yeah, I mean, technically they are in hell, but they're not in hell proper. So this idea of limbo, I mean, it's a theological concept which was created in the late Middle Ages. And its primary purpose was actually not to deal with the question of the virtuous pagans. Its primary purpose was to deal with the question of unbaptized children. So children who die in infancy, which obviously is a massive issue for medieval people and a great source of anxiety. Augustinian theology dictates that original sin deserves punishment, and therefore, even if a child doesn't have the chance to live a life, if it lives at all, then it will be condemned to some kind of punishment. And yet, of course, the idea that unbaptized babies are punished in the same way as, unrepentant sinners is morally unpalatable. And so the idea is that there is a limbo infantium, a limbo of the infants. But then others kind of creatively adopt this idea of limbo, including Dante, and they essentially want to believe that some of the virtuous pagans and virtuous infidels, and this is an interesting addition that Dante makes. So not only when he goes to the limbo of the pagans with Virgil, not only does he meet people like Plato and Aristotle, but he also meets some people who had died after the time of Christ, like Avicenna and Averroes, these Muslim, he even meets the shade of Saladin, who was famously courteous to his enemies. And so these are people who are Muslims who had died after the time of Christ, and yet they are deemed virtuous enough to enter this limbo of the pagans, and there's a kind of citadel where the greatest of all these intellects, like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, live. So yeah, they don't suffer punishment, but obviously they are deprived of eternal joy. They are deprived of the beatific vision of God.
It's interesting that limbo is the most popular imagination of hell. Like that is what you see in modern TV shows, and that's what when, for example, in Lucifer or in Preacher, to mention some, the limbo is the most popular imagination of hell in media and also in comic books and books in general. It seems to be limbo. You see the representation of in us hell.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the Catholic Church itself has abandoned the idea of limbo, because limbo always had a rather ambiguous theological status. It was a theological opinion rather than dogma. There was never a church council or a pope who definitively defined limbo. And I think because the idea of unbaptized children being condemned to eternal punishment is one that has fallen out of fashion. So most
Fortunately.
most Catholic theologians now would say that the mercy of God would allow unbaptized children to go to heaven in spite of the penalties for original sin. So yeah, there was a fairly recent declaration that limbo was not a theological opinion that theologians should be holding. So, that was trailed by the media in lots of places as the Catholic Church abolishing limbo, which isn't quite true, because it had never definitively said that limbo existed. But certainly, yeah, I think it's fair to say that limbo has fallen out of fashion theologically.
But let's talk about the second circle, which is of course lust. And one of the people he meet there is Achilles, I believe, and Tristan, and of course Cleopatra and Dido among others. So let's talk a little bit about people and the second interpretation, that is lust.
Yeah, well, this is the beginning of hell proper, but it's interesting that in Dante's hierarchy of sins, these carnal lusts, the sins of the wolf, are the least serious, the least grave. And to some extent, this reflects the thinking of the medieval church and the practice of the church courts. So in the medieval world, there are various penalties for fornication, for adultery, but it's notable that adultery never becomes a felony. It never becomes a capital offence in the medieval world. So it's always, of course, one of the greatest sins because it's prohibited by the Ten Commandments. But there is a recognition by the medieval church that the flesh is weak. And therefore, although these are unambiguously sins, they are the least grave of sins because they are sins of the flesh rather than sins of the spirit.
I think
And
I
if
know
you
where I'm going to end up.
but if you that Satan, the greatest sinner of them all, is a being of pure spirit, it follows in medieval thought, in medieval theology, that sins that are pure sins of spirit or sins of the will are the gravest sins. And therefore, sins that you have committed only because you happen to have a human body with human appetites, they are ipso facto less grave sins. And therefore, sins of lust and sins of a carnal nature, they are less grave. And so, yeah, he enters this area where the lustful are constantly being buffeted by these violent winds. And what this represents is the idea that lust is ultimately empty and misguided, and you are allowing yourself to be directed by forces that are less than human, kind of bestial forces, which are kind of bringing you to a position where you are cut off from God. And yeah, he encounters a lot of these kind of famous lovers of history, lots of queens, so like Dido, and yeah, some interesting characters. And one of the great things about the Inferno is that Dante has conversations with a lot of these characters that he meets along the way, and so they will kind of bewail their own sins. They will kind of warn him of the danger that there is to human human kind of temptation. And sometimes, he will have a degree of sympathy for them as well. So this is not simply a one-dimensional kind of cardboard morality tale of, these are bad people, don't be like them. There is this sense of sympathy as well. And I think it's really important to bear in mind that all of this is happening on Good Friday. So Good Friday is a day of the year when Catholics are supposed to recollect their sins and kind of have an examination of conscience as they come to the memorial of Christ's suffering on the cross, who has suffered for all sins. And so there's this sense that you become aware of your own sins. And by becoming aware of your own sins, you become aware of the price that Christ has paid on the cross. And Dante is doing this in the most dramatic fashion possible by literally meeting all these people along the way who have committed sins which he himself might well be guilty of.
I want to pause a little bit about the circles of hell, and I want to ask, because when Dante travels through this journey, is it safe? Like, can things happen to him, or is it, because it's my understanding that he is several times in danger of his own life, which is kind of ironic because he's dead. But is he, or is he dead when he travels through the journey? Is it just a live being just traveling through the Inferno with Virgil as his guide?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question of the extent to which he is safe. I mean, he is alive, and as a living being in hell, he is somebody who is very much out of place. He shouldn't be there. And that's a theme that we encounter again and again in these Anabasis narratives from the classical world of, those who go down to hell. There's always the danger that they won't be allowed to leave again. So if you as a mortal have transgressed that boundary, you have to enjoy divine protection. And although Virgil does have this divine mandate from God via Beatrice, he himself, of course, is someone who is of a lower order than Dante, because he is a pagan shade who doesn't suffer the pains of hell, but has nevertheless been condemned to hell, and therefore doesn't have the privilege of the living. He is that when you die, you forfeit the right to God's mercy because you have had your chance, if you like. Whereas Dante, as a living being, he still has a chance to make amends. Virgil doesn't. There's no chance for Virgil to accept Christ as his savior, whereas Dante can decide he's going to make amends. But if you get stuck in hell, that won't happen. And there are various monsters. So there's Minos, there's the Minotaur, there's Geryon, who menace Dante and are about to attack him. And it's at one point, I think it's with Geryon. It's only when Virgil appeals to God, and they both appeal to God, and an angel is sent down to restrain Geryon from attacking them. So they are. It is not a safe situation. They are not. Yeah, they're not completely without danger. And I think it would be impossible from a narrative point of view for for Dante to make this compelling if there weren't an element of threat. So I think, Dante's got to introduce this element of threat to himself.
And I remember you spoke about sympathy earlier, and I think there was a scene where there's one guy being tortured, if I remember correctly, and Dante Virgil says, well, you can torture him if you want to, but I don't feel sorry for him, he deserves to be here or something. I don't remember exactly where this is, but I do believe that there's one scene where it's like, oh, I think Dante wanted to torture him, and I think it's an enemy of Dante or something, and he says like, don't feel bad, he deserves to be there. You can torture him if you like.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there is a degree of vindictiveness with Dante. I think that sometimes he comes across as a rather unsympathetic character because he sort of wants people to suffer. But there are other moments where he will encounter someone who he believes must be in hell because they committed a sin. But nevertheless, there was friendship between them. So there's one point where he is on this kind of desolate desert plain, which is the wandering place of the sodomites and usurers, and he encounters someone there who had been a philosopher, who had been a friend of his in life, who is among the sodomites, which Dante believes is a sin which has to be punished. but it doesn't change the fact that he is, he still has friendship with him. So there is this kind of humanity that cuts through this suffering. And of course, that raises deep and troubling questions, about the mercy of God and about, the extent to which, if our humanity allows friendship to continue beyond death, why does God prolong this suffering? Why doesn't God show mercy? And I think that the way that Dante deals with that is through the medieval kind of theological concept of the centrality of repentance. So when we get to Purgatorio, there are some pretty heinous sinners, in Purgatorio, but they are people who before their death had repented. And the key thing about the people in the Inferno is that, some of them were sympathetic and humane people, but they were people who committed sins and tried to justify those sins to themselves. And it's that sense of being unrepentant and always trying to get in the last word and always, never acknowledging that you were wrong. And there is a sense, therefore, in which that makes you a worse sinner than someone who was an awful, awful person but sincerely repented before they died. And again, I think this is something rather alien to us that is very much rooted in the medieval mentality. That in the medieval mentality, it's not what you do, it's the ultimate attitude that you have at the moment of death, whether that is an attitude of genuine repentance.
There's also something like murder and sins, because if you murder someone, it should be out of lust or love for a person, that it shouldn't be spontaneously, and you just murder. There was this worse sin to lie, and actually, I think you mentioned this briefly, Dan, to actually murder someone, because murder should be kind of an accident as well, or just kind of a spur of the moment thing, and should be forgiven. However, if you lied about certain things, that was worse than murder.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the very distinctive aspect of Dante's understanding of the hierarchy of sin, where lust is the least serious of sins, albeit serious, followed by sins of violence. So when he goes down to the middle circles of hell, these are the sins of the lion. These are the kind of people who have been overcome by anger, overcome by vengeance, and this is very, very dominant as a theme in contemporary Florence of his time. In that it's a place of extreme violence. It's a place of bloody vendettas. It is a place where everybody is carrying a dagger. Everybody is armed. People are quick to defend themselves, and self-defense can very easily spill over into murder and mob violence and these kind of murderous events that happen. It's a very, very dangerous place. The murder rate is higher than anywhere probably in the modern world, proportionally speaking. And so I think there is this sense in which, although violence is a very serious matter, it is not as serious in Dante's mind to the most serious category of sins of all, and these are the sins of the leopard. These are the sins of fraud, deceit, and betrayal. And Dante famously considers betrayal to be the greatest of all sins. And I think that this is very reflective also of the world in which he lives. This is a world in which it's extremely hierarchical. It's extremely structured. There isn't a great deal of social mobility. And when there is social mobility, you are reliant on the favor of patrons. And so this is a world of extremely wealthy and powerful patrons, where power is concentrated in the hands of a few men, both civic and ecclesiastical. And therefore, if those patrons are faithless, if they fail to reward genuine service, that discredits the entire system. And likewise, if those who serve, if those who have pledged their fealty and their allegiance, and this is a world of oaths and promises, if they fail to keep their allegiance, the system falls down. So that kind of hierarchical late medieval society, it only works well, and it only works to the glory of God, in Dante's view, if people keep their oaths, if people keep faith. And if they break faith, there's no going back. So in contrast to a modern democratic society, you know, where you can replace your leaders ultimately if you're fed up with them, in a society where you can't replace your leaders, where people rule by divine right, where people are the choice of God, where they hold, you know, kind of God's mandate to govern, they are under a deep, deep duty of responsibility to maintain their faith. And that's why fraud is the greatest danger to society. And it's basically a hatred of corruption. Dante hates corruption. And this is something which, again, we find a theme in classical literature. You know, if you read Tacitus or Cicero, these are authors who, at least in their persona, I mean, you know, they themselves might have engaged in the odd bit of corruption, but in their persona is a kind of a hatred of corruption, of degradation, of decay. There is a theme of social decay, you know, people allowing the accumulation of great wealth to corrupt them. And this is true of the Roman Empire, the late Roman Republic, but also, you know, 14th century Florence. 14th century Florence is a place where it is very easy to get rich quick. But of course, the richer you get, the greater the moral responsibility on you to, you know, maintain your oaths.
How do students of Dante and medieval Florence deal? It's a bit tricky subject to deal with the idea that their lying is perhaps greater than murder, greater sin than murder. So how do students of medieval Italy and Dante's Inferno deal with this? Because this can't be an easy subject to handle, I believe, for a modern audience, and especially for modern young students of 21st century.
Yeah, I think that it's very counterintuitive because we have been formed as kind of modern Western people within the shadow of John Locke's social contract theory. So the idea being that the right of a ruler to govern is in some sense a kind of a tacit contract between ruler and governed. And therefore, if a ruler betrays a trust, I mean, it's bad. Sure, it's bad, but it's not the worst possible thing that you could do. So, you know, we don't tend to think that Boris Johnson, famous for being
Yeah,
economical with the truth and having a loose relationship with the truth, is somebody who is
to
worse
say the
than
least.
Hitler. You know,
Yeah.
we tend to think the greatest sins that you can commit are the exploitation of power to commit atrocities and genocide and things like that. We don't tend to think that, you know, betraying your oath and lying in and of itself is the worst thing that you could possibly do. And yet Dante, at the very base of hell, the ninth circle, he's got traitors to their kindred, so, you know, the followers of Cain, if you like, who murders his own brother. They are the least bad of traitors. Traitors to your nation are worse than traitors to your own family and blood. And traitors to your Lord, they are the worst people of all. And again, I mean, we would probably not put it that way. We would probably say that something like fratricide, you know, murdering your own sibling, is worse than betraying your Lord. Because, you know, the reality of politics is that, you know, people end up changing sides, people end up, you know, shifting allegiances. You know, we might think that that is disgraceful and not very good, but we don't tend to think that that is the worst sin that a human being can possibly commit. And so I think that there is an element here of kind of social performance going on in the Inferno, in that Dante is trying here, rather like Plato in the Republic, to set down a blueprint for an ideal society. And in an ideal kind of Christian hierarchical society, the one thing that has to remain sacrosanct is the relationship between master and lord. And in a medieval society, that is you know, to use a phrase that, you know, is not necessarily always taken that seriously by historians now, but I think still has some kind of resonance, is the idea of the feudal bond. But what Dante does is to theologically elevate the feudal bond between master and sort of sworn servant by essentially telling us that that was the relationship between Jesus and Judas. So the disciples of Christ have kind of sworn to serve him as their liege lord, which is an interesting interpretation
Yeah.
of the Gospels that isn't necessarily justified by the text. And therefore, Judas is the worst sinner of all time. But that in itself, in medieval theology, that is controversial. To say that Judas is the worst sinner that ever there was. There are those medieval theologians who would say that, yes, Judas commits the sin of betrayal, and yet there is a sense in which Judas, because he is part of the plan, there's got to be a betrayer. There's got to be someone who, takes those 30 pieces of silver in order to betray Christ, because Christ has to die. That Judas plays this role in the history of salvation. And when Jesus says on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, that could be taken as a kind of an exculpation of anyone who's been involved in what's happened, because it's got to happen, because Christ has got to die for the sins of all. And so there is a tradition within Christian theology of seeing Judas as somebody who possibly could be redeemed in the end. And so to say that Judas is the greatest of all sinners, who's constantly being gnawed forever and flayed by Satan, is that's a take. That's one way of looking at it, but it's not necessarily the way of looking at it that every medieval theologian would have had.
I want to go a little bit back, and we're going to talk more about the Ninth Circle in a minute. But I want to talk about one poet that it does meet, and that is, of course, Homer. And he kind of is ballsy, because he places him up there with Homer. And I think fourth in line of Homer, that's kind of ballsy. But even now, if you read the Iliad, and there's some scholars I think have talked about how he maybe haven't read the whole Odyssey and the Iliad, so do we know even if he is able to do that comparison to Homer? And what are your thoughts on that? Does he deserve himself ranking himself by the side of Homer?
Yeah, well, I think that the sort of the elevated position that's given to Homer reflects a medieval obsession with classical poets as great kind of philosophers and sages. And I think this is very much out of kilter with the way that we would look at classical poets. So, we, for example, would look at Virgil as somebody who was a rather sycophantic figure, somebody who, writes an epic, the Aeneid, which is all about praising Augustus and kind of this massive work of propaganda for an emperor. So we wouldn't necessarily view Virgil as a very exalted figure, whereas in Dante's time, Virgil was seen as a great sage. I mean, some saw him as a great magician as well, sort of weird kind of tradition that develops around Virgil. And Homer, likewise, the traditions about Homer, that Homer was blind, blindness in the ancient world and in the medieval world, it can be seen as a disability, but it can also be seen as a kind of marker of someone as a prophetic visionary, because it's almost as though their earthly sight is taken away, and that means that they are able to see more clearly into the world of the gods and the world of the divine. And so, yeah, Homer has this kind of reputation as someone who is an extraordinary kind of visionary, somebody who is far-sighted and sees into the world of the gods. And I think part of this is because the gods feature in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and how could, looking at this in a naive way, how could Homer have understood the will of the gods and seen the gods unless he himself was some kind of prophetic visionary? Now, from a modern perspective, we would say, oh, this is a literary device, the idea of the council of the gods discussing what's going to happen. But, medieval people would often say, well, maybe this was real, maybe he was looking into the world of the gods and understood this. And so, yeah, they kind of become elevated in a way that we probably wouldn't elevate them.
It's also interesting that some of these characters are in hell, because as you know, there's a lot of early medieval Christianity that prayed for some of these patrons, such as Socrates and Plato and even Homer, to be allowed in heaven, because they didn't know better, because they weren't aware of Christianity, that some of them prayed for them to be allowed up there, because so it's interesting that they also would be placed in hell when a lot of people prayed for them to get to heaven, because they didn't know any better.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are these extraordinary traditions within kind of early Christian and medieval thought about, virtuous pagans. I mean, for example, you've got Justin Martyr, is one of the early Christian writers, who writes about Socrates and says that the daimon that Socrates claimed to have as his kind of guiding spirit in the Apology of Socrates was possibly an angel who was sent to assist him by God. So the idea that Socrates is some kind of pagan prophet, and the ideas about Hermes Trismegistus, as somebody who was the great sage of the Egyptians, who was receiving divine inspiration. The idea that Aristotle was a kind of semi-divine figure. I mean, this actually originates among the Muslim philosophers. So Averroes, talks about Aristotle as the most perfect man who ever lived, and this is taken up by some of the more enthusiastic Aristotelians. It's interesting that Dante doesn't seem to be a completely invested Aristotelian. He doesn't elevate Aristotle to the highest position, because Dante only puts two pagan figures in heaven who, by some kind of special exception and dispensation of God, are allowed to go to heaven. And that is the Emperor Trajan and Ripheus, who is one of the most heroic and virtuous of the Trojans. Dante seems to have a definite preference in the narrative of the Iliad and the Odyssey for the Trojans over the Greeks, and meets out some pretty nasty punishments to Ulysses, the kind of the Greek leader, and indeed Achilles. So yeah, he tends to sort of give them a more sympathetic ride to the Trojans. But why these two figures? Why Trajan and Ripheus? And scholars are always debating, what it is about these two. And I think in the case of Trajan, it's partly because there are these sort of rumors that Trajan might possibly have become a Christian, which is not historically accurate, but sort of there are these medieval traditions about various emperors. I mean, likewise Marcus Aurelius, there were rumors that he might have become a Christian because people read his works and they thought, how could somebody be this wise and this virtuous and not be a Christian? And they said the same about Seneca. Seneca, there were these rumors that maybe he secretly met the Apostle Paul because they were alive in Rome at the same time. Maybe Seneca secretly corresponded with him and secretly became a Christian, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, there are these traditions about pagans who might have somehow transcended the ignorance of their idolatry.
Isn't there at some point a pope as well in Dante's Inferno? I may remember wrongly, but isn't there a pope in there somewhere?
Oh, there's lots of popes. Yeah. So Celestine V. So when he enters the very edge of
It's
the
kind of, it's
Inferno.
kind of ballsy. Again, it's kind of ballsy to put popes in hell, especially in the medieval era of the time that Dante wrote.
It's not as surprising as you might think. In fact, when you look at the imagery of hell mouths in Doom paintings, so when you get hell portrayed as a huge dragon
Yep.
with a gigantic mouth and these kind of naked figures of the damned being shepherded into hell by a demon, it's almost more common to find one wearing a papal tiara than not. So this sense that actually even the highest in Christendom should be condemned to hell, and that follows really from the basic kind of principle of the Christian gospel. The last will be first and the first will be last. The greater the responsibility imposed upon you within Christendom, whether that be kingship or rule of the church as pope or being a bishop or whatever, the harsher the judgment, because you have been entrusted as pastor of souls with the souls of other Christians, and Christ will judge you most harshly for having led them astray. So in the vestibule of the futile, which is the kind of the very edge of hell, where we find the kind of the souls of the vacillating, those who sat on the fence and weren't committed to either side. We find Celestine V, who is the guy who renounced papacy. So the only pope other than Benedict XVI who ever abdicated the throne of St. Peter. And Dante holds that against him and said, you should have held on. And you find Pope Anastasius, who's accused of heresy. You find Boniface VIII, who's accused of simony. So yeah, lots of popes, lots of bishops. They are just because somebody holds office in the church, just because they held a high position, doesn't protect them from damnation. If anything, it makes it more likely.
Clement the Eighth come to mind.
Well, quite, yeah.
So let's start talking about. We're going to round up soon, but let's talk about we have to talk about the ninth circle of hell as well, of course, the final circle before it goes to heaven. So let's talk a little bit about what he finds down there and his interaction with the devil or Satan.
Yeah, so essentially the kind of cosmology of the Inferno is that when Lucifer rebelled against God, he was thrust down to earth with such force that he essentially penetrates the earth and ends up taking up a position at the center of the earth. Dante's earth is, of course, a sphere, because medieval people well understood that the world was a sphere, and so Satan is at the center of the earth. He is embedded in ice and suffering. He has three faces and three mouths and this kind of hideous, hairy, kind of bat-like appearance. And he is chewing with his mouths three great traitors. So Longinus, who is one of the people who betrayed Julius Caesar, Brutus, the betrayer of Julius Caesar, the assassin of Julius Caesar, and Judas Iscariot. And this is, again, a very striking feature of Dante's Inferno. I mean, the idea that Judas would be down right at the lowest pit of hell, that's not beyond, the bounds of what one would expect from medieval thought about Judas. He's not a popular figure within Christian thought. But yeah, why Brutus and Longinus? Why elevate Julius Caesar to this extraordinary position of being a kind of an almost divine figure whose betrayal merits the most heinous punishment in the entire cosmos? This is rather extraordinary. And so you get this kind of mingling of the biblical and the classical right the way down to the very lowest pit of hell, where Dante takes the view that Julius Caesar was kind of God's chosen instrument to create the Roman Empire. Now, this is important because Augustine, probably the most influential single figure on the medieval Western Catholic Church, Augustine had written a book called The City of God, in which Augustine argues that the Roman Empire was terrible, it was pretty awful and idolatrous and put Jesus to death and all that. But at the same time, if the Roman Empire had not existed at the time of Jesus's life and death and resurrection, it would not have been possible for the Apostle Paul and the other apostles to bring the gospel to the entire world, because the Roman Empire had conquered the known world. And therefore, it was God's will that the Roman Empire should exist. Now, if it's God's will that the Roman Empire should exist, that means it was God's will that Julius Caesar should declare himself Caesar, and ultimately, Augustus should become Caesar and found the Roman Empire and so forth. So anybody who betrayed and killed Julius Caesar was acting against God. So again, it's this kind of hierarchical mindset in operation. But I think also it reflects, there's been a lot of psychoanalytical kind of approaches to the Inferno. And I think a lot of this is pretty tenuous, but I think it does reflect Dante's personal preoccupation with betrayal. He is a man with a persecution complex. He is somebody who has suffered a great deal of betrayal in his own life. And, he has found himself, the whole course of his life has been changed because people have broken oaths to him. And so I think that sense of betrayal is the ultimate sin. That's because for Dante, in Dante's personal life, betrayal is the ultimate sin. And somebody who had led a different kind of life probably would have chosen a different sin as the ultimate sin that's being, punished by being chewed up by Satan.
What was it kind of in bitterness that Dante wrote the Divine Comedy a little bit? Because it's a little bit in spite, maybe, because he was exiled at the time, of course, and he was, so was it a little bit bitterness in there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that in the Divine Comedy, we encounter a book that is deeply personal. There is an element of it that is a kind of a personal rant, a personal fantasy. The exaltation of Beatrice, of course, is the ultimate kind of fantasy of the immortal beloved. And yet, what makes it a work of genius is that it rises beyond merely someone's, personal kind of wish fulfillment fantasy and, vengeful screed, because Dante is such a learned figure. He is someone who is so immersed in the biblical, the classical, the theological. It's almost as though he channels the entirety of the complexity of the medieval mind through the Divine Comedy, which is, I think, why it remains an absolute kind of touchstone of the Middle Ages. When people are told, when students are told to, go and find out about the Middle Ages, it's impossible to avoid the Divine Comedy because it is such a charismatic work. It's so easy to read. I mean, I think because the Divine Comedy was written in the vernacular, it's that too is a watershed. Writing an epic poem, a major work of literature in this kind of peasant urban slang that's being spoken on the streets of Florence instead of Latin, at a time when anyone learned was writing in Latin. It's extraordinary that the Divine Comedy was written in Italian and not written in Latin. And that, I think, has an impact on translations, because if it's written in a vernacular language, that instantly makes it easier for a translator, or perhaps not easier, but makes it more of a ready possibility for a translator to convey in another vernacular language like English the immediacy of the text, because it doesn't mean that Dante is constantly mimicking the classical writers, which immediately kind of sets up another barrier, as well as the barrier of language, against kind of a modern reader relating to it. What Dante has got to do, because he's writing in a vernacular language, he's got to invent that vernacular language's forms of expression for himself, like Shakespeare does with English. He's got to kind of come up with stuff from scratch rather than constantly withdrawing on these kind of classical sources.
I do believe that historian Paul Stratton, in his book The Florentines, credit Dante with kind of creating a modern Italian language. Is there truth to this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in it. I mean, he's not the only one, of course. Boccaccio is another major figure who's writing in vernacular at the time. But I think that, yeah, it's because this sort of embryonic sense of a national identity, which of course doesn't have any kind of doesn't reflect politics, but it does reflect culture. There is no politically united Italy, but there is this sense in which Italians are kind of seeing themselves as a civilization, with their own culture. They are starting to feel that they might have reached the same kind of civilizational level as the Romans. They might perhaps be even on the brink of surpassing that civilizational level. And of course, that feeds into the Renaissance, the year 1300, in which the Divine Comedy is set. That is the year of the Great Jubilee in Rome. And that's the year when Pope Nicholas V orders lots of the city of Rome to be cleared for the pilgrims who are coming for the Great Jubilee. And as a result of that clearing, incredible statues and works of the classical world are discovered. The Laocoon, this extraordinary sculpture of Laocoon and his son being attacked by snakes, that is still to this day can be seen in the Vatican museums. That's dug up in the year 1300. And it inspires, countless sculptors and, the beginnings of the Renaissance. And so a lot of scholars would say this year, 1300, this is the year that the Renaissance begins, because it's the year that the classical past is literally being dug up from the city of Rome itself.
Kind of foreshadows archaeology a little bit, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But I think that what's different, compared to our approach to archaeology, we think of archaeology as being kind of excavating the distant past of people who are very different from ourselves. What the Italians of that era, of the sort of the High Middle Ages, they see digging up the past as kind of almost a digging up of the future, because this is what we can be. This is how good we can be at sculpture. Or at metalwork, whatever it is. That's what inspires people like Bernini and Donatello to be the absolute best they can be, to exceed the masters of the ancient world.
I want to talk a little bit about the publishing and the aftermath of the release of Dante's Inferno. Was it looked at as controversial at the time, or how did people perceive the Divine Comedy, because it's most that we talked about. This is kind of what people would later come to think of as hell. When if you think of modern imagination of hell, Dante's Divine Comedy is what kind of created this public image of what hell looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people had their own kind of very fixed ideas of hell, which were kind of determined to a large extent by art in churches. And so, these Last Judgment paintings, Doom paintings, very, very common, of course, and people who were not literate, that's how they would understand hell. And I think, Dante, in some respects, is very original. He departs from traditional understandings of hell. The most famous way in which he does that is by portraying the lowest reaches of hell, the ninth circle, as a place which is frozen rather than a place of fire. And theologians have been saying for decades that hell is a place of fire. Exactly how hell, how fire can punish you when you don't have a physical body is, something which scholastic theologians are constantly debating. But I think, when the Inferno is released, I think it is received primarily as a kind of work of literature and a literary allegory, but it also does have theological consequences, and I think also moral theological consequences, in that what Dante is putting forward is not just an idea of hell and how people might be punished, which, ultimately is speculation and fantasy. He doesn't know this for a fact. He's not claiming to be literally a prophet. But also this sort of sense of how sins are categorized, which is moral theology, the business of deciding what is worse than anything else. And I would say the influence of the Divine Comedy on moral theology is probably greater than its influence on what people actually thought hell was like.
Hmm. But I want to talk a little bit this is probably a episode of his own, but about because he wrote kind of a sequel as well where he goes to heaven, and then from what I understand, it's not as exciting as the Divine Comedy because it's set in hell, and of course that's more popular and that's cooler to go through hell than in heaven because it's kind of like from what I understand, some scholars talked about this. They said that the first stage circle is amazing, and the second one is even
Yeah.
better, and then the third one, and that's amazing. I never thought. I mean, I thought I was happy before, but now, wow, So that's sort of is this sequel where it goes to heaven kind of worth reading, or it's my
Yeah,
understanding you can kind of skip it if you.
I think this is a kind of a narrative trap which afflicts all authors, which is that evil characters are always much more fun to write, and they're much more fun to read about. And this is why
Yeah.
we all love a villain. And as soon as you start to, imagine really, really good characters are often, a bit boring. And of course, we encounter the same problem with Milton. When Milton writes Paradise Lost, notoriously Lucifer is the most interesting and the most charismatic character in the whole epic. And yeah, I think this is true also of the Divine Comedy, in the sense that far more people read the Inferno than read the Paradiso or read the Purgatorio. I think probably the Purgatorio is the least read of all these works. But yeah, the Paradiso. I mean, I think it is a great work. I think because, again, he is imagining heaven in a new way, and the way in which he is kind of sublimating a romantic love that he feels for Beatrice with divine love, and kind of negotiating that kind of paradox, which, the religious believer is always faced with, because there's earthly love, which is such a powerful force, and yet also the obligation to believe that divine love is a more powerful force yet. And how do you reconcile those things? And I think that is also fascinating. And I would urge people to read the Paradiso as well as the Inferno.
Before I go, I gotta ask this question: if the Divine Comedy were written today, who do you think would be? I mean, more recent people. Who do you think would be? I feel like Epstein would be down there for sure. But who do you think would be in the Inferno?
Well, yeah, I think we as a society, we have our sort of own ideas, don't we, of people who are,
Hmm.
yeah, kind of paradigmatically evil. And I think we have our villains as a society, don't we? I think we probably, we'd find people like Hitler down there, but we'd also find, people like Jimmy Savile and, Muhammad Al-Fayed, and, people who've been discredited after their deaths, and the terrible things
maybe.
they've done have kind of been exposed after their deaths, haven't they? But yeah, it's interesting how we, as a society, we tend to classify sins quite differently, and we tend to think of sins of murder and genocide and child abuse and sexual sins and violations of consent and things like. We tend to think of those as the most dreadful sins rather than betrayals.
And I want to ask one final question, of course. Why should people read Inferno, and what should you think people should look at when they read the Inferno, or the Divine Comedy?
I think, it's the best way into the High Middle Ages to understand the worldview, the cosmology, the absolute kind of interpenetration of the classical with the biblical, the nature of kind of medieval Catholic culture, its diversity, its openness to external influences, but also at the same time, the way in which people navigated a rigidly hierarchical society. So it's all in there. It really is. It's the most extraordinary document of the medieval world in some respects.
And it's an epic for sure. It's up there with the classical epics. I would definitely say. We talked about how comparing himself to Homer, and personally I think it's well deserved that he is up there among the classical epics.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the epic of the Middle Ages.
Before you go, of course, do you have anything you want to promote or anything you want to share social media? If people have further questions about religious medieval history, or if people have further questions about Dante's Inferno or Dante's Divine Comedy, where can people find you? Do you have any links you want to share in the description below, or anything else you want to get out while you can?
Yeah, well, you can follow me on Twitter if you don't already do so. I'm at Dr. Francis Young, and that's a lot of nonsense and hopefully also interesting things that I will write about. In terms of a book that's relevant to the discussion that we've been having today, I'd recommend my most recent book, which I co-authored with Robin C. Douglas, which just came out, which is called Paganism Persisting. And that's a book which really looks at this question of how people in the post-classical world, so in the medieval world, but also going through into the Renaissance, into the early modern world and the modern world, related to the pagan past and actually tried to revive the pagan past. And we've been talking today about how Dante has a sympathetic outlook to some of these pagan figures. Well, there were some people who had an even more sympathetic outlook and actually tried to revive paganism. And so that's what that book, Paganism Persisting, is about.
We made an actual episode a while ago about this topic, which you should absolutely check out as well. Now, thank you so much for coming. It's been a great pleasure to have you on. I should also add, before I forget this, we do have a live stream tonight at 9 p.m. You see Central European time, or 8 p.m. UK time, and the rest of the world can figure out what time so that will be in for yourself, wherever you listen. And it's a Halloween stream, so we talk about witches and everything Halloween, not just history, but everything, from Halloween movies to the interpretation of demons, witches, and anything. So do enjoy. Stay tuned for tonight on YouTube. I will put a link in the description below, so you can add it to your calendar or for later today. And of course, we are also available on Twitter/X under that H12. I also share a lot of memes and a lot of nonsense, hopefully some good stuff too. And you can find us on Instagram and with that H12. We are available on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars. If you like this episode, you can also give us 1 if you absolutely hate this podcast. It's a free world on at least this side of the world. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, consider writing a review. That would be great. If you're on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget our live stream tonight over on YouTube. Please, my name is Alan. This has been with that H12, and I see you.